We haven't. We didn't hear the introductions because we were instructed to walk in as though this was a television program. So we have no idea what's already been said. So I will.
What things have been made up about us? Who knows?
So I'll wrap a little bit of an introduction into what I think is the first interesting topic to discuss. It has less to do with Gehry per se than with Paul Goldberger. Okay. Who we all know as a longtime critic at the New York Times. Later we read him week by week in the New Yorker and Vanity Fair, many other institutions in which he kept alive the often endangered flame of architectural criticism. And some of those writings have been anthologized in various of your publications, and others have been the point of departure for books of essays. I quickly tried to put in author search in the Avery architectural catalog, which you can consult online, trying to separate out books and articles to try to bring the numbers down to something manageable that could be searched on an iPhone. And I was unable to discover any earlier traces of a temptation to biography. So did I? You're
right. No, so there are none.
I wanted to start with that because I think that the first question is really going to be what attracted you to try a genre that you haven't tried now and up until now. And this, for those of you who have already got a copy, is an incredibly engaging read, but it is not the 4 or 5 columns allotted by the New York Times, or even the maybe 3 to 4 pages allotted by the New Yorker. It is a very substantial book to go with a very, very long career. I've read a lot of architectural biographies as an architectural historian, and they are a very, very difficult genre to put together. It's not like writing the life of a politician or the life of a public figure where life and work might come together, I think, more easily. The biggest challenge is how do you do justice to the life and to the work, and what connection do you want to establish between the two of them? So there are about 6 questions packed into that, but maybe you can just start by telling us what made you want to take on this book.
Well, I like your phrase, the temptation to biography, because in fact I did feel a certain desire to do something different and to take on a longer project without but on the other hand, you know, I did not want to write a biography of a sheep farmer in New Zealand. I mean, I wanted to do something that made some use of the knowledge I had accumulated over the years. And so it was a way to do something that was very different in some ways, and yet not different at all in other ways. I came to Gehry in particular, in large part, at the suggestion of both my agent and my publisher, who said, you should do a biography, and you should do a biography of Frank Gehry, because we would like to publish one. And that's a good start, I suppose. I think my literary agent was also trying very hard to prevent me from falling into the other temptation that many journalists have, which is thinking they can write a novel. And I think she felt, you know, anything to keep this guy from writing a novel, it will probably be terrible. And so maybe if he takes on a biography, that would satisfy some of those desires. So
we'll have to wait. We'll have to wait for the novel.
No, I don't. Yeah, you may wait quite.
She's wise or
you may wait quite a long time.
What did? I'm sure that many things that you learned about Gehry will come out over the course of our conversation, and probably out from questions that some of you all might have. But what did you learn about writing a biography that you didn't expect when you set out to do this project?
I learned, like a lot of things, it's harder than it looks. the greatest challenge was what I thought would not be a challenge at all, which was organizing it. Because in fact, you think, oh, you know, biography, it's very easy. It's a biography by nature has to be chronological. You start at the beginning and you just tell the story to the end, and there you are. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. Because of course, life is far more complicated than that. And it becomes, if you truly tell it day by day or week by week or even month by month, you're bouncing back and forth between a dozen different subjects, not only between personal and professional lives constantly, but between all the different strands of professional life. I mean, if you think of somebody like Frank Gehry is working on, you know, 10 different projects at once, and they have very different arcs, very different timelines. I mean, there was Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles that was a 16-year project, and then there are other things that, you know, take only a couple of years, and then there are other things that start and completely stop and then start again. And so how do you make all this coherent and yet not do violence to the truth? Because unlike a novel, you can't kind of make up all the parts and decide, all right, this is going to happen this way because it fits that way. There is a certain truth to how things happened, but you also have to tell the story in a way that's convincing and clear and coherent to people. And life doesn't actually happen in neat patterns like that. It just doesn't. And so that was the hardest thing to figure out. I guess it was sort of a little bit like maybe writing a screenplay would be. I've never written a screenplay, but I suspect it sort of had some of those challenges.
It's interesting that you say this about the novel, because it suddenly occurs to me that you did have to, and now you saying it makes me think retrospectively back as the reader, you had to decide what the themes were. You had to create a storyline. Life, you know, life has many storylines. Happily, Frank Gehry has a psychiatrist, and psychiatrists are all about finding storylines out of what just
that helped. That helped,
and
definitely.
I think we're probably going to have to go there a little bit, but also, there are other characters you create in the. I mean, they are people.
You can't quite create the characters, but you can.
You have to figure out who are the other dramatis persona.
Yes, and which ones matter, which ones don't.
Exactly.
Which ones are supporting characters, which ones are really just cameos, and so forth. That's true.
So one thing that struck me as thinking, you know, how would a writer take on Frank Gehry? You know, if you're choosing the topic of Frank Gehry, I suppose you already have the assumption that he's worthy of a biography. But then you have a really interesting phenomena with Frank Gehry. He's not like Frank Lloyd Wright, although you make some very interesting use of the relationship of Frank Lloyd Wright to try to set up the topic of the life and the topic of fame, which is an important one. But he's very unlike Frank Lloyd Wright in that he is an incredibly late starter. There is actually not a building produced by Frank Gehry that is going to make the world pay attention to him probably until the Danziger Studios. So
and that barely. It was really his own house.
Yeah, right.
Which was a dozen years after the Danziger Studio that really captured the world's imagination in a major way.
So was that an issue for you in this artistic biography when you're going to have a very substantial number of chapters before you have a work of architecture that you as a critic would either salivate over or intellectualize or take on for the interweaving of life and work?
Well, to some extent, yes. But you know as much or more about architects' careers than I do, because you've also spent your life with them, and you know that the exception was Frank Lloyd Wright. It's actually quite common that architects' careers are sort of slow to mature, and that they're slow to really make it in a significant way. I knew that it was just going to be inevitable that it would be a while before we got to the architecture. That was one of the reasons why the book starts not at the very beginning of the chronology, but with a kind of setting up chapter that summarizes a lot of stuff, but starts with a scene toward actually just a few years ago here in New York. And also because I realized that there is no more boring opening sentence imaginable than Frank Gehry was born on February 28th, 1929 in Toronto General Hospital. I mean, if I opened a book like that started with that sentence, I would close it and be done with it. Yeah. So that's another thing one learns about biography, is often starting with something that engages the reader and then stepping back to the chronology. So I felt by having done that and told some of the story, or at least some highlights of it at the beginning, then I could spend a while before we got back into architecture, because there was this taste of architecture in the opening chapter. Still, yeah, I mean, I went back and forth about, is this too much Toronto? Is this too much being a truck driver in Los Angeles? Is this too much struggle, too much about his education and all that? I think I got it right. I don't know, but people will decide, I guess.
Well, I think the flashback technique works very, very well, but it then, I suppose it raises the question, what then do you develop as what you want to pay attention to out of that early life? And this is a biography of a living person, so much of,
which raises a whole other set of issues, of course. A whole other set of issues, and much of your evidence will come from conversations and your own experience with the area, and we probably need to talk about that, because that's a very interesting issue. It's quite different from looking for letters or diaries or what physical traces a historic architect might have left outside of his or her buildings. But how did you decide what story to tell about this once you're back to the guy's got to get born, even after the flashback? Yes, he does. He does.
Flashback, and of course, there's the wonderful line that the book could have been Goldberger on Goldberg because he's not born Gehry.
That was his line. Yes. Which I had to put in the acknowledgments at the very end of the book, because if I gave it away at the beginning, it would, of course, have told the story about his change of name, which I wanted to hold till it actually came up in the narrative. So deciding what matters was to some extent, it was a matter of thinking about, what are the themes going to be? What are the key issues? And one of them was or is a sort of constant angst and anxiety, and a drive for success combined with an inability to be fully confident in his success, and to worry all the time. And also a theme that I realized recurred in his life of walking away from something that might be of great potential benefit to him, either economically or some other way, because he didn't feel he could control it, that some degree of autonomy was being taken away from him. And then I realized that all those things go all the way back to his childhood in Toronto, and including even a time when he had a little tumor, not a benign one, obviously, not a malignant one, on his leg, that he had it from birth. And his aunt, who had a little more money than the poor immediate family he was born into, offered to pay for a surgical procedure to remove it when he was about 5 or something like that. And he so freaked out at the notion of the anesthesia that he got up and refused to sit down again on the doctor's operating table, and never did have the procedure. And I realized that was actually, in a way, the beginning of a pattern that led to his creating a huge and very successful line of furniture when he was not yet successful as an architect, that was written about all over, was featured at Bloomingdale's, that he then walked away from because he thought the money people were taking over, walking away from the New York Times building that he was almost finally designated to do because he decided he didn't really like or couldn't fully control the New York Times, and so forth and so on. It was a pattern. So that some of it was just wanting to lay the groundwork for other things that would be themes that would show up later. Really.
So that comes across very strongly, this leitmotif of the walking away from from the great opportunity, and this anguished figure, so that when people say at certain points, and you yourself say at one point, "Oh, Frank Gehry, he's so easygoing," and you think, easygoing? This guy is tying my stomachs in knot reading about him and wondering what is the next thing he's going to run away from in the next
or worry about.
I almost wondered at one point if you were ever tempted to walk away from this topic of how do you deal with the hero who's an anti-hero, this hero who is, most artistic biography runs the risk of hagiographic. It's a little hard to get hagiographic about this figure. Has this strong Woody Allen streak of kind of
yes,
angst.
In fact, actually at one point I describe him as a cross between Frank Lloyd Wright and Woody Allen, two seemingly incompatible characters. But that is, in fact, what makes him fascinating, or did for me too. I mean, there is he's, as we've just said, in kind of constant angst, yet there is this affable, almost avuncular, unpretentious, aw shucks exterior, facade to him that is indeed a facade. It's a construct. He is driven and anxiety-ridden underneath it. But it's a very different external face than most artists or architects or famous and successful people in any field actually choose to have. This sort of, oh shucks, I'm just a little schlumpy nobody thing, which is it is somewhat disingenuous, and yet at the same time, it's not altogether wrong. Because while he has an enormous ego and a driving ambition, he is, in fact, a friendly, kind, and thoughtful person in many ways. So, and somebody who really does not want to live a life of enormous grandeur and pretension. I mean, he still lives in the house he designed that made him famous in 1978, which is a relatively small house on a street corner in Santa Monica.
With a high volume of tourists.
With a high volume of tourists, right, exactly. a lot of tour buses go by and all that. But, and in fact, they've put up a little partial wall, and they bought a house next door and tore it down to have a little bit more of a garden. But nobody.
You even recount him buying property to build a bigger house and then walking away from that.
That's another walking away from story. You're absolutely right. Although more recently, he did try again and is building a much, much grander house on the fancy side of Santa Monica as opposed to the plain side of Santa Monica. But even there, he and his wife are fraught with ambivalence about whether to actually occupy this house. It's about 2/3 of the way finished now. And I think he figured that this one, unlike the other one you mentioned, was worth building because it's on a very fancy street in a very fancy neighborhood, and he's more famous than ever, and if they decide not to move in, he can sell it for a fortune and make pots of money on it. So I think he figured it's kind of a no-lose proposition. But, and in fact, there's a big retrospective of his work now at the LA County Museum that includes a model of this house that, because he did not want it publicly known that it might be his house, it's labeled as Spec House.
So we all know now.
So now you know that the thing that's there that says Spec House is actually his house. However, maybe it will be a spec house, because maybe he will decide not to. He actually truly has not made up his mind and goes back and forth and back and forth. So
I'd like to stay with two sets of questions. I'm going to say both of them, which is inconvenient, but I want you to remind me if I forget to turn to the other. So one has to do with this becomes a very psychological biography. So you're very engaged with these psychological traits. It's more the history of this anxiety, these types of characteristics. I suppose the first question has to do with, could we talk for a few minutes about the relationship between the psychology of this individual and the architecture? Because in the end, this is a biography of some of the most important buildings of the second half of the 20th century. And then the second will be you in relationship to him, you as the writer who is getting involved in this psychological portrait of a living person with whom you've spent a great deal of time, probably also a friend. So we'll maybe put that one on hold, and let's talk for a moment about the architecture. Takes us back to the very first question. How do you weave biography and artistic?
Weaving, the narrative of a life and the story of the work together was, as we said, that was a big challenge. And I tried to balance them off best I could, because it's a book that is aimed primarily at general readers, and because there are already many monographs and catalogs and so forth of Gehry's work. I did not want it to appear to be driven by criticism. And I mean criticism in the sense of analysis, not positive, negative. And I wanted it really to be driven by the narrative of the life. But if a narrative of the life of any creative person is to have any meaning and validity, it has to analyze the creative work to a certain extent. And it's fascinating to me, actually, because the book has just come out. There are a handful of reviews so far. I hope there'll be more. I noticed one of them said, well, there's not enough criticism and it's too much just the story of the life. And another one said, oh, it's Goldberger just talking about architecture all the time, and that's when it comes alive, and then the stuff about the life seems sort of less. So I figured if two reviewers had opposite views, then I must have gotten it just right, actually, in terms of the balance between these two things. I think, actually, one of the most important things is not so much to connect the work and the life as to not fall into the trap of believing that they are invariably connected at every moment in every way. I think actually that's a fallacy sometimes of biographies, particularly psychologically driven biographies. Everything is not rosebud. Everything is not explainable by one childhood incident or even by one aspect of psychological makeup. And many things about Frank are inherently contradictory, not just the aspect I mentioned earlier about the aw shucks exterior and the driven thing underneath it, but also there is this equally driven need to do his own creative work and be in control of it. And at the same time, there's an almost unquenchable desire to please people and to make his work be pleasing. He is as interested and eager that his work make people feel comfortable, unusual though it is, as, Robert Stern might be in some, neo-Georgian house he designs. In other words, Frank is not interested in his architecture appealing only in an intellectual or a cerebral or a theoretical way. He really wants it to be viscerally comfortable. And so that was another sort of theme, was the duality there.
That's where I think the Frank Lloyd Wright comparison becomes very meaningful, because there are, and it was interesting that you say now that it was your agent who pushed you in this direction, because it does seem to me that Gehry is one of the few architects who inherits the strange characteristic of Frank Lloyd Wright, which is that every member of the public knows Frank Lloyd Wright.
Right.
When you go to visit a Frank Lloyd Wright building, there is often a crowd there, and you ask them if they're interested in architecture, they pretty much can tell you no, but they're interested in Frank Lloyd Wright.
Right.
And I think that, at least since the Bilbao phenomenon, Frank Gehry falls into this.
He actually broke through into the broader culture, from the architectural culture into the broader culture. That's right.
So I guess I want to go back and try to push you to answer a little bit more the question. What do you think is the relationship between, it's paradoxical, between this very angst-ridden life and this architecture that's generating the fame? And in his case, it's quite different from Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright became famous for his architecture, and he became quite infamous for his scandalous life.
Right.
Until you wrote this book, most people outside of the inner circles of architecture don't know a great deal about Frank Gehry's life. And it's not. See a relationship? No relationship.
Right. It's had its ups and downs, and it's good and bad moments, and times where he has behaved well and behaved badly, but it certainly has not had the degree of scandal of Frank Lloyd Wright's life, which really could be an opera. I mean, it really has sort of, and indeed had immense tragedy, as you know, in it. I think to the extent that there's a relationship, it is really also through another duality, which is a curious combination of great sophistication and innocence. I mean, there's a sort of earnestness and innocence to much of the work, even though he is, of course, the last thing in the world from what we would call an innocent or naive person. But I don't think that the personal angst plays out directly in the work, in that it is in fact a complex but not an angst-ridden architecture. It is an architecture that uses very different means to seek a kind of resolution even, or comfort or serenity, even though I know that serenity is hardly the first word any of us would, in a free association test, bring up with Frank Gehry, but nevertheless that this desire to be, to somehow please, and yet to also be bold, rather than please by being quiet and meek and well-behaved. That sort of sums up both the character and the architecture. I think, again, one always wants to avoid too much easy pop psychology or pop psychiatry or whatever we call it, but there was a certain amount of a theme of eagerness to please his father, who was a very difficult and unhappy man who had failed continually at many, many ventures in his life, and then died before he saw any of Frank's real success, and always thought his son, he had accused his son of being a dreamer and unrealistic. And so I think that he was in fact a dreamer, but he also had a sort of both driven and practical side, and never really got over wanting to please his father.
That, I think, is very convincing, it's very poignant, and who isn't saddled with wanting to please the father and doesn't have a complicated relationship to the father. So I think it's something that the reader can identify with and start to connect with Frank Gehry. So maybe that is a segue back to the unanswered half of my question. What was it like working with Frank Gehry on this? I was going to ask you structurally, why did the acknowledgments come at the end? And you've already offered one reason that they did. But there you not only thank many people, but you say a number of very, very interesting things. And one is you recount the relationship out of which this book stems. So
the acknowledgments came at the end for a couple of reasons. One of them, the one I mentioned about not wanting to give away his funny line about call this book Goldberger on Goldberg. But the other was the acknowledgments were kind of long and somewhat discursive and conversational, and I didn't want to put something so long at the front of the book either. I just think it feels better then. Who basically, if you haven't read the book yet, who cares about the acknowledgments? It's much more meaningful to someone who actually has read the book than before. So there are many, many reasons they went at the end. The first thing I should say about working with him on this was that I did not sign a contract with the publisher until he and I had a letter of agreement about this project, because I felt I could only do it under certain conditions. Again, this is a challenge of a living person. There were actually 4 conditions in this letter. The first was that he give me access as much as I wanted to both him and his archives, and encourage other people. He can't order anyone to see me, but certainly not discourage anyone from seeing me. The second was that he not do the same thing with anyone else for at least a certain number of years. The third, which was a more difficult thing to ask for, was that he agreed that he had no editorial control whatsoever over the book. I said to him, look, I can understand if you're not comfortable with this. Few people would be, but if you're not, that's your privilege, but I then will not go ahead with this book. So until he had agreed to that, I did not want to sign a contract and obligate myself to actually do this book. And the fourth, which was actually a little harder to ask for, you'll understand why, because it was a little bit awkward, was since he was 81 when this project began, I felt I had to ask that the first 3 provisions would also apply to his estate or his heirs or whatever, because I didn't want to be in the position of putting a couple of years into this and then he dies and his executors say, sorry, go away, no more cooperation, and then I'm stranded in the middle of the project.
But you didn't know enough yet to put number 5, you may not walk away from this project.
Ah, right. That he may not walk away.
Right.
You're right. I actually didn't, you're right. I didn't think of that. Thankfully, that one was not necessary. None of them were necessary in the end. It all worked out fine. And he did ask for the right to read it once, solely for fact-checking purposes, which I agreed to because, of course, it's very helpful to me. And he did, in fact, find a number of small things, names and dates, things in that category, where somehow we misunderstood or screwed up on a date or something. So that was very helpful to correct all those things. I also know that there were many things in it that he didn't like. And he was entirely and completely honorable in keeping to our agreement and did not even hint at asking me to make any changes there. So,
just as one gets to know him in the book, I can imagine that this project must have made him extremely anxious.
It did, of course, but of course everything makes him anxious. That's just his nature. But yes, it did somewhat.
So let me ask another question about you, and then I don't know. I'm not paying attention to the time. So I hope someone will give us a cue when I should stop monopolizing the conversation. But of course, I've been reading you for many years, and but I didn't really have the time to do the homework on a question that came up for me as I was reading, triggered by one very curious fact, which is that often when you want to bring in the reception of a building, you will turn to quote a critic.
Yes.
And you never quote yourself. So now you must have written about Frank Gehry over the years. You must have evaluated these buildings. You must have already come into the project with some critical sense that you seem to have tried to put a little bit on the side to perform biography.
Right.
Even to the extent that when you refer to the New York Times, nowhere in this book, if you don't know it, would you know that you were for many years the critic at the New York Times, and probably, I assume, wrote about Frank Gehry, but you quote from your successors, Herbert on a number of occasions, and Nikolai gets mentioned in passing. So I wondered for you, what was that act of sort of taking a kind of remove
no, that's a really interesting question.
Because you have a long history of forming a critical relationship to the work.
I think I'm a little more in there than you think, however. A couple of ways. One is that a few times I quoted myself without quoting myself, which is to say I plagiarized myself, which is to say I used, I mean, you can't plagiarize yourself, that's the good thing. I looked back at certain things I'd written and from time to time would weave, a paragraph or two into this narrative without actually revealing it without presenting it as a quotation. I think, for example, some of the comments about Bilbao were from my New Yorker piece about Bilbao. And I did that here and there. I think that the source notes at the end actually do reveal that stuff when it's done, but I think it was because I felt a book like this should not be written in the first person. And so I wanted to avoid any sentence in which I said, that says, blah, 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 quote, as I said in the New York Times. So I just felt somehow violative of the structure. That was one reason. Another reason is that I wanted to be generous toward fellow critics and not pretend that I'm the only person who's ever had opinions about Frank Gehry's buildings. And from time to time, other people said things that I felt were particularly meaningful or cogent, or represented a contrary view. For example, where it discusses the Fondation Louis Vuitton, which opened last year in Paris, there are a number of quotations from other critics, but including several negative ones from English critics. But I do just talk in my own voice in the narrative of the book. And that, my own view, I think, is ultimately not hard to discern. And finally, there were a couple of times where I realized things I had done over the years made me a kind of character in the book. And I had to figure out a way to deal with that. One of them is that I actually wrote a piece in the New York Times Sunday Magazine many years ago about the Ron Davis house, which was the first Gehry house to have been published in a national general interest publication. And that sort of played a role in beginning to bring him to broader attention. Again, I didn't sort of want to appear to be quoting myself directly, so what I did was I told the story of how this thing was written, and then I actually put in a footnote, but a footnote right there on the page, not a source note at the end, so no reader would miss it, that I was the writer of this piece, and blah, blah, blah. And similarly, one that even played an even bigger role, some of you may remember the saga of Peter Lewis, the billionaire insurance mogul, who fell in love with Frank Gehry and spent many, many years and $6 million in fees in having him design a house that became ever more complicated, ever more elaborate, and went through many, many, many iterations. And then in 1995, quite suddenly, Peter Lewis abandoned the whole project. One of the reasons he abandoned it was that there was a cover story in the New York Times Sunday magazine that was called Houses as Art, which talked about very ambitious, very unusual houses that are designed as one-off things by important architects, and talked about how sometimes this yields very great things, but other times it doesn't, and sometimes it's too indulgent. And I think the line had the piece had the line, while the client who always says no is no good and of no use at all, sometimes the client who can only say yes is no better, and that you really need a good dialogue between architect and client. And Peter Lewis thought that that was directed at him and got very upset, not with me, but with Frank and with the situation. And also, it didn't help that Frank Gehry was quoted in this piece as saying, you know, I don't want to, I'm an old-fashioned liberal do-gooder. I don't want to do, you know, $30 million houses for rich people. What does that do for the world? In fact, I told this client, why don't you just build yourself a little $5 million house and give the rest to charity? Well, Peter Lewis didn't like that either. He canceled the whole project, and I only learned years later that this article was sort of part of the reason. So I sort of told the story, but then again put a footnote in that said it was me, but I only learned years later that I had played a role in this part of the drama, which I thought was a way to kind of, it would have been false to the story to take myself out of it entirely, but I really didn't want the narrative to be me, 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 because it was not about me, really. So that was how I dealt with that one.
Let me ask you the art historian's question,
Sure.
since I'm an art historian, and you probably thought this was the first question I would ask. And then maybe we should segue
Sure.
to some audience questions. In reality, there aren't that many architectural biographies.
Right.
So to do one is already a choice, and says Frank Gehry, of all of the
Right,
possible
right.
subjects, is worthy of a architectural biography. So I wonder now, on the other side of it, what would you say that you would want the general reader to take away from this biography of being the importance of getting inside Frank Gehry? What is Frank Gehry's project in architecture, and why should the general reader, you know, why should the general reader really need to know about this? In other words, is there going to be a 17th and 18th biography of Mozart, but there probably are no biographies of Salieri, right?
Right.
So-
Well, I think it's fair to say that among architects, Frank Gehry is certainly more in the Mozart category than the Salieri category, right? So what I want the public to get out of it, I think, is a sense that creativity is difficult, full of angst. It is not easy, that work relates to a life, but not in a simplistic or direct or automatic way. And I think that there's also an aspect that makes the experience of buildings more interesting when you know a portion of the backstory. And just as knowing how a building came to be from a political standpoint and who wanted it built and what the client's story is, knowing the architect's story also just inherently makes it more interesting and appealing. The same way that when you go to the Guggenheim Museum on Fifth Avenue, yes, it is true that the form and the space are so powerful and so potent that they can communicate on their own without anything else being known. Nevertheless, it's a richer experience still to know what Solomon Guggenheim thought he was doing with his collection, how he went back and forth, what role Hilaire Rebet played in that drama, and most importantly, Frank Lloyd Wright and his complicated and tortured relationship to New York City, and the many, many years it took, 12 years from, I believe, 12 or 13 years from original design to opening. Of course, that's less than Walt Disney Hall now that I think of it. So all of that, so that one's experience of the building becomes enriched by that other dimension. And so it really, I might say, in the end, it's really about adding another dimension to one's experience of a place.
I'm sure there are questions from the audience. I'm just assuming that I may be the a handful of people who have already read the book. And before I give it to them, I just want to thank you for one thing, not only for a great read.
Thank you.
But one particular insight, the Irving Lavin story about the folds in the Bernini sculpture in relationship to the last 20 years of Gehry's development, for me was a kind of flash of recognition, and really
spoken like a true art historian.
Very exciting moment in the book. So I'm sure there are questions.
Irving Lavin is one of the people who was most insightful and helpful about Frank too. I mean, I went to see him and his wife in Princeton. He's the great artist, Renaissance art historian who's at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. I think we were supposed to have lunch, which we did, and then we just started talking about Frank, and I looked at my watch and I said, my God, I have to be somewhere in New York at 8 o'clock, and it's already 6:30. So it was just a wonderful day.
Yeah, if there are any questions, please raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone on over.
Thank you. As an architectural critic, did your opinion of Frank Gehry's work change over the course of doing this project?
My general opinion did not change. No, I think it became deeper and fuller, and the projects I like best, I continue to like best. The ones that I don't think fully succeed, probably most of all, the Experience Music Project in Seattle, I continue to feel aren't the best, aren't terribly good. I felt that I came to re-understand what I might have never known or might have forgotten, which is how much of a connection there is between his very different, plainer, almost funky early architecture, the stuff that he, with the chain link fences and the plywood and the corrugated metal and all what he used to call cheapskate architecture, how important that was to what came later, and that they are not completely different. They're different periods, but one builds on the other, and there's also a through line that connects them. But I didn't, there was no 180-degree switch or anything like that. It wasn't like I thought he was a terrible architect and I discovered he was a good one, or the other way around. No.
Other questions?
I met you and mentioned I live in Columbia, Maryland, where the early architectural work was done. In fact, I'm in the Gehry building every week. But what I'm wondering, and my question is, his work there is very unlike what you would think of Gehry today. Is that because of that's where he was as an architect at that point? Is it because Rouse was socially progressive, was conservative?
Rouse.
His buildings, yeah. Yep. Or some other reason.
Well, he had one thing that we haven't talked about, but that is in the book, and is, I think, a fascinating chapter in the book, episode, is that he had a long relationship with James Rouse, the real estate developer, did a lot of work for Rouse. They bonded over a kind of sense of social responsibility and belief in cities, but at the end of the day, they really didn't have that much in common in terms of taste. And but there's a side of Gehry that has always been somewhat pragmatic. And the buildings he did for Rouse are kind of basic. And they have a certain degree of plainness to them that isn't in total violation of his aesthetic. It just doesn't take it very far. And but they do push, you know, the buildings like the Rouse headquarters he did in Columbia, Maryland, which I think is now a Whole Foods supermarket, it was not quite a typical suburban office building. It was a little different, but not overwhelmingly different, not dramatically different in the way we think of Frank Gehry as being. And there's a great story that is in the book, but I'll repeat it anyway. When he did only one, Rouse became famous, of course, for shopping malls. Gehry had generally not done malls for him, but done other kinds of projects. But when Rouse was doing a shopping mall in Santa Monica, he really felt they owed it to him, and he wanted to show that he could do this kind of thing. And he had become, in fact, by then fairly dependent on Rouse, and a lot of his office was not people doing unusual houses that got him excited, but people doing more conventional work for Rouse. And they did Santa Monica Place, it's called, and you know, it ended up being rather compromised, and there's some Gehry-esque aspects to it, not very many, not as many as he'd hoped. And toward the end of the project, by which time he had done his own house, the famous house in Santa Monica, he invited the president of Rouse, a guy named Matt DeVito, to come over for dinner. He liked him very much. They got along very well. And he showed him the house. And he looked around at the house, and he said to him, "Frank, this is quite amazing. And this is really the kind of architecture you want to do, right?" And Frank said, "Yes, this is right." He said, "So why are you wasting your time with us?" he said. And here's another Gehry walking away story. So he thought about that, said goodnight, and then 2 days later called Matt DeVito and resigned from all the projects they were doing and fired half of his office because he had to cut back by at least 50% to survive if he was not going to have those commercial projects, and said he was going to make a go at doing only the work he really cared about.
He tried to walk away from Columbia before he took the job.
Well, right. He tried. At one point or another, he walked away from almost anything. That's right. He did. There's a story that's in the book too. It was he almost walked away from everything. So another one of those interesting conflicts in him as a character is he is either the most laid-back prima donna in the world, or the most prima donna-esque non-prima donna. I don't know which one, but you know, there are those two sides of him too.
Further questions?
What was the biggest surprise that you uncovered during the researching and writing?
What was the biggest surprise I uncovered during the research and the writing? That should be an easy question, but it's sort of oddly not. I don't think it was one that related to his architecture, although maybe. Let me answer that with two different things, very different. One is this theme that I have been talking about walking away from things that could have been, and in some cases already were, of great financial benefit to him. I hadn't, until I got into the research, really realized that that was a theme, a through line that went all the way through his life. That was one. The other was realizing how I knew he'd been married before, his current wife, who he's been married to for 40 years. I've known him a long time, but not before this wife came in. And I didn't realize how truly miserable his first marriage was, even though it started out very happily. how mismatched ultimately he and his first wife were, how badly he treated her and she treated him, and how badly he treated the children of his first marriage. So, you know, he is not, while this book is quite positive, he is not, you know, it's not an unvarnished hero story at all, and as, to use the word Barry used earlier, it's not a hagiography. You know, it shows him as a very real person with some very real flaws. And, you know, and somebody who would, when he handled the two children by his second marriage far better than the two children by his first marriage, who he largely ignored as they were growing up. Tried desperately to make up for it when they became adults. And then actually, quite tragically, his relationship to his eldest daughter was only really resolved when she became ill with uterine cancer, and in the last months of his life, they had a great reconciliation, and he took extremely good care of her. But it was obviously a tragic and painful time. So there's a lot of non-architecture stuff in this book, definitely.
We have time for one final question, if there is one.
So, given what you've said about a career that's so fraught with anxiety and indecision, how do you believe Frank feels about the legacy he has left and will leave us with?
Right. Good question. I think his own personal anxieties are somewhat separate from the sort of legacy issue. You know, I mean, the personal angst kind of culminates in a quote toward the end of the book, amid all the hoopla about the Louis Vuitton building in Paris, and he's sitting in the lobby of the Georges V Hotel saying, God, I wish I could enjoy this as much as I'm supposed to. But I just can't bring myself to. I just keep worrying something will go wrong or whatever, or it won't last, you know, what have you. But he does think a lot about legacy, and I think while he's very proud of the major buildings, Louis Vuitton being the most recent of them, but Bilbao and Walt Disney Hall being the most prominent, I think he very much does not want them to be the only part of his legacy, the central thing to his legacy. I think he cares a lot about some other things. First, this technology company that he created, Gehry Technologies, that pioneered the use of CATIA software, which is a software that was created for the aerospace industry, that they brought into architecture and really enabled the creation of buildings like Bilbao and other things that would have required such complex mathematical and engineering calculations that they really could not have been built without digital technology, which he has said many times he wants to do, not just to enable him to build these buildings, but to give the architecture profession more control over buildings again, and that because the building process is so much more complicated today than it used to be, and there are so many, and you know, projects have construction managers and owners' representatives and project managers and everything else, and you know, whatever, layers and layers and layers that often separate the architect from the project, and as complicated projects move forward, often changes are made that the architect does not want or does not even know about sometimes. And he sees this software as a way of kind of controlling the process and bringing the architect back to a central position. So he wants that to be a part of the legacy. And then a third part is really a kind of social benefit, architecture and social responsibility. I mean, he was correct in that quote that I gave you before about Peter Lewis, when he said, you know, he really is, there's a side of him that really is just an old-fashioned liberal. And he doesn't want to just do fancy things for rich people, even though he kind of likes doing that. And he likes hanging around with famous people, but nevertheless, he sort of wanting it both ways is a theme that goes all the way through the life. And right now he's doing a community mental health clinic in Watts as a pro bono project for no fee. He's done a couple of other things like that in Los Angeles. He has taken on a huge project of redesigning the LA River, which is a 51-mile thing going through the whole Los Angeles region that many, many years ago was turned into essentially a concrete culvert. And how it can be restored as a kind of public benefit and public space is something they're also doing at the moment, at least, without a fee. And I think he wants to be remembered for things like that and things like the technology advances as much as certain big one-off buildings. He wants his legacy to be all that stuff right now.
Fabulous. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.